Hello there, I'm William Lassiter. I'm interested in teaching the history. Today is May 2nd, 2024. And we're going to be covering today the fall of Berlin and the end of the war. So I want you first to take a look at this picture. What do you see there? This is a very famous picture. Originally, this was a photograph taken by Yevgeny Kaldai called Raising a Flag Over the Reichstag. Okay? And what do you see in that picture? You see smoke, lots of smoke. You see buildings, or something that looked like buildings once, perhaps, but isn't really buildings anymore. It's kind of just a ruin, isn't it? Devastation. People in the streets, barricades, tanks. You see over here on the right-hand side, these are statues. These are not humans, these are statues of humans. These are great figures from German history. And here's a man here, a young private, and another fellow down below there, and they're raising a flag. Whose flag is that? Yeah, it's a communist flag, the flag of communist Russia. Yes. And they were conquering Berlin May 1st and finally declaring it conquered May 2nd, 1945. Now, you may have thought originally that it was America that conquered Berlin and defeated the Germans, the Nazis, but you would be wrong. You see, it's not America. We didn't actually end up conquering the German Nazis. I mean, we drove them all the way to Berlin, but actually it was the Soviets that conquered Berlin and took Berlin. And that's because we agreed to allow them to take it. So what you're seeing there is you're seeing Soviet soldiers, communist soldiers from Russia, down in the streets and raising the flag over what's called the Reichstag. That's the main capital building of government of Germany, going as far back as the 19th century, probably further. And they have conquered the city. They've also devastated the city. And this is due to something that we actually agreed on as Americans. This is reading from your text here, or my text. This is A Light to the Nations, The Making of the Modern World, Part 2. And it says here on page 600, with Hitler dead, Admiral Dönitz, Dönitz is the commander of the German army, because basically Hitler has already taken his own life. He did that on the 30th of April in the bunker there in Berlin. He got married to his mistress, Eva Braun, and then he took his own life. So he wasn't even around. There was a report that said that he died fighting valiantly against the oncoming communists, but that's not true. He didn't. He shot himself. Anyway, Admiral Dönitz is the only remaining commander of the German army at this point, and it says here that he actually asked General Eisenhower, for terms of surrender. Eisenhower is the American commander. But the American general said Dönitz had instead to surrender to the Russians. He insisted that he surrender to the Russians. And this is what Dönitz had wanted to avoid, but since the Russians had been the first to reach Berlin, it was Stalin's right to accept Germany's surrender. By May 4th, all the German forces in northwestern Europe and Italy had surrendered, and 4 days later, a formal armistice was signed at Eisenhower's headquarters in Reims, France, at midnight, May 8th, 1945. The war in Europe formally came to an end. So what we're looking at in this picture is essentially the end of the war, World War II. It came to an end a few days later, officially, but here's the actual end. There was no one left in Berlin at this time to fight against any oncoming forces. The German army had been reduced to children, the young Hitler Youth, and old retired men who had fought in World War I, many of whom hated the Nazis but knew that if they didn't fight, they'd be destroyed. So they were fighting in the streets, basically to defend Berlin, and they fought to the death. And the Germans were overrun by the communists, and basically there was a spree of about 3 or 4 days where the Soviets went pillaging, raping, burning everything in sight. And human life and human individuals didn't matter at that point. They were treated like cattle. The text goes on to say that Berlin was like a city of the dead. And so the American general Lucius de Clay described the once proud capital of Germany as it appeared in the days and weeks following the end of the war. They had been bombed, of course, by Allied planes, and then the Soviet soldiers had fought all across the city, just burning and destroying everything in their path. Eventually, they had taken the lives of 250,000 people in Berlin alone. They had allegedly liberated the city, but they committed atrocities against the city's population. Just the most horrible things you can imagine. As the text says, if Berlin was a city of the dead, much of Germany could be called the land of the dead. The war had just devastated Germany. Cities have been laid waste, over half of their housing destroyed by bombing, their people suffering from hunger and starvation. The living may very well have envied the countless millions who had died during the course of the war. What was true of Germany was true also much of Europe. It has been estimated that the war killed 50 million to 65 million people in Europe and in the Far East combined. In Europe alone, the number of dead may have reached 15 million to as much as 20 million. No war in the history of the world has ever spilled so much blood. No war in the history of the world has ever spilled so much blood. World War II still stands today as the singular most devastating war in human history. Now, we haven't had a war like that since then, thanks be to God, right? But that war was the most devastating war in human history. Unbelievable how terrible it was. And if we look at this picture again, you can imagine that it would have been really, really bad to be a combatant. But think about if you were a non-combatant, if you had to live in those buildings and you had no gun, you had no way of defending yourself, and things had been already bad because they were pinched for food. They were starving already in Berlin. And with the Soviets coming, the Germans were desperate to be able to make a treaty with the United States. But they didn't at first, because the US allowed the communists to roll into Berlin and to destroy the city. If you were a civilian, you might still be living in one of those burned out buildings in that picture, having to live day by day, struggling to find food, and watching people you loved die. It would have been a horrible business. I can't underscore enough just how tremendous World War II was. And the question comes up, why? Why was it so tremendous? What caused such incredible loss of human life? Why was this war so devastating? Not just because of the bomb we dropped on Hiroshima, not just because of the death camps that the Germans created, not just because of the awfulness that the Soviets perpetrated upon the Germans, but because of something else, I think, something that happened in human imagination even before this war. The human person is not just a bag of juices. The human person is a spirit and body both. And when the spirit receives a hit, the after effect ripples for many, many years to come. It's not just physical damage, it's psychological damage. And it may be that human history is similar, that things that happened in our past are like a strike. And that strike ripples through human history for hundreds, perhaps even thousands of years. And so we have to ask ourselves this question. What had happened before the war that made this war so horrible? We'd had wars before. Certainly the history of human civilization has been involving war constantly. War is another form of diplomacy, it was once said. War is the singular event that humans do, it has also been written. I would suggest this. Richard Weaver, whom we'll read eventually, Richard Weaver, in his book Ideas Have Consequences, points out that the things that we saw so horribly in World War II were the end result of ideas that came before. Wars don't just break out haphazardly. It's not like just you're walking along one day and suddenly, boom, there's a war. It's not like slipping on a banana, or suddenly accidentally tripping on the pavement. Wars happen because ideas. And what are the ideas that preceded the war? This is why it's so very imperative to actually take account of the ideas that are being promulgated in a civilization, and why it's so important for everybody, young people, older people, middle-aged, everybody, to take into account what ideas you are actually subscribing to. Let me point out two authors really quick, just to see their comment on this. The first author is G.K. Chesterton, which we're all familiar with, of course, and he's writing in 1922. Now, Chesterton was very prodigious, but he particularly wrote this book, Eugenics and Other Evils. He was writing against a mindset that was as old as the 1870s, the mindset of eugenics. Now, when we look at World War II, we have to take into account all sorts of things like fascism that had developed over the course of the 19th century, there in the unification of Italy and the unification of Germany and all. We have to take into account nationalism that was on the rise at the end of the 19th century. We have to take into account communism that developed in the 1840s under Karl Marx. But eugenics is another one that Chesterton is specifically responding to. And he says two things about the eugenics movement. One, that it is a state of anarchy to subscribe to it. And second, that it is a state of madness to subscribe to it. He says, anarchy is that condition of mind or methods in which you cannot stop yourself. It is the loss of that self-control which can return to the normal. It is not anarchy because men are permitted to begin uproar, extravagance, experiment, peril. It is anarchy when people cannot end these things. How else could World War II have ended? Wars had happened before, but this war went on for, if we count 39 to 45, 6 long years, as though it could not end. When the Russians poured into Berlin, it's as though they couldn't stop themselves from raping and pillaging. Anarchy, Chesterton suggests, was released upon the world primarily in that eugenics movement, that subscription to the idea of eugenics. And he also goes on to talk about the eugenics movement as a mad operation. He says, the madman is not he that defies the world. The madman is he who denies the world. Not defies the world, but denies the world. In other words, he denies the reality of the world. Denies that things can be such and such. No, we can fix the world. We can dominate the world. We can control the world. We can make the world bend to our will. That's madness, Chesterton points out. And when we look at that picture, we can certainly confirm that the World War II was a state of madness, and much of it stemmed from the very same root that gave birth to the idea of eugenics. What was that root? A third fellow to throw into the mix is this fellow, Romano Guardini, in his book, The End of the Modern World by Romano Guardini. Now, Guardini is publishing in 56, so he's publishing 30 years after Chesterton and after World War II, but his observations take us way back, because Guardini says that it wasn't the eugenics movement that gave rise to World War II. It was something prior to the eugenics movement that gave rise to that madness and that anarchy that Chesterton points out, which was the eugenics movement, which led to this inability to stop oneself and this desire to dominate the world. What Guardini suggests is that all this went back to the 13th century. So you see how the course of your historical knowledge extends from the 13th century, 1200s, all the way to the 20th century where we are now, May 2nd, 1945. That's a long time to think about history. But Guardini suggests this. He suggests that the idea of a unified world, a unified universe, that's what the word means, was broken up in the 13th century when the two camps of the realists and the nominalists split from one another. And the nominalists who said that things are true only in name, that there is no reality beyond this world, they were basically suggesting that ethics itself is a human construct and can be manipulated and changed and altered. Remember, ideas have consequences. And if you hold the idea that ethics and other things can be manipulated and changed according to human whim, you run into some serious problems. Guardini says this: when man drops the ethical reins, he places himself utterly at the mercy of power. The inner barriers of self-respect and self-defense must fall before power can really violate. In other words, those inner barriers of self-respect and self-defense are swept away when you subscribe to the idea that all these things like ethics and morality are man-made constructs. And Guardini is suggesting that therefore there is a connecting line that goes all the way from nominalism to the eugenics movement to the destruction of civilization. He says, trace the connecting line which leads from control of human conception to interrupted pregnancy, from artificial insemination to euthanasia, from race breeding to the destruction of undesirable life. You see how it just goes right through, because it's all the same idea. Human beings, human individuality can be violated and controlled, because when you get rid of the idea of morality, the compass of morality, the compass of ethics, all you're left with is a cycle of power. Who dominates whom? Who controls whom? Is it the German Nazis who believed in eugenics dominating over the Soviets? Or is it the Soviets who believe that every individual is unimportant, only the state is important, dominating over the Nazis? Or is it both dominating over the modern world? I'll conclude with this. Guardini says this. He says, the true, the good, and the right are realizable only if accepted by living people with inner, genuine conviction. And to bring this about requires reverence, encouragement, patience. He who would be truly effective with men must respect their freedom, stir their initiatives, awaken their creative centers, not dominate them. Working with the impulses of living persons, he must freely accept all their false starts and detours. The greater a man's power, the stronger the temptation to take the shortcut of force. So see, in that world of power, which is the modern world, in that world of power, if we don't respect these ideas, we will not respect the individual human beings that are the embodiment of those ideas. Or to put it another way, if we no longer respect God, we will no longer respect man, who is the vessel, the image, the likeness of God. And therefore, we will be very tempted to take a shortcut of force, to sweep everything away, like Galadriel suggests, to make everybody worship you, the individual, and despair. That's why your education is so important. That's why what you're doing as a young student is so important. Not because you're going to save the world necessarily, but because you might be saving your own integrity, your own self, and defying these forces of darkness that led to this immense loss of human life and destruction that we see May 2nd, 1945.